Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. This is Story Dive, back again, reviewing another episode of American Gods. This time Season 2, Episode 5, titled The Ways of the Dead. This one was one hell of an episode, one of the best written episodes, if not the best written episode I've seen so far. It was very powerful and moving in places, but it was not for the faint of heart. They get into some stuff in this episode that is pretty brutal, some real dark aspects of American history, and they don't pull any punches, they don't censor it, they just lay it all out there. So to me it was a strong episode, some great performances and great writing. But, like last time, I'm going to go over the entire episode, break it down as best I can, and point out all the Easter eggs and references I noticed. And if you haven't seen the episode already, there will be spoilers at this point in the video. The episode begins with an image of a young girl who has been murdered, and then shows a lynching of the man who was blamed for the murder. We find out later that this man is Will James, nicknamed Froggy, or Froggy James. And this is a reference to an actual man who was lynched in Cairo, Illinois in 1909. The facts of the actual case are very similar to what they show us in the show. Will James was charged with the murder of a young girl named Mary Pelly, but before he could receive a trial, a mob found him and lynched him. As Mr. Ibis alludes to later, the sheriff of the town tried to hide James in the woods so that he could go to trial, but the mob found him. He was hung in a public square, shot, his body was dragged, mutilated, cut up, burned. The lynching was attended by thousands of residents of Cairo, and in the end his severed head was put on a pike and left on display. So in the show, they show us some of these events until Shadow wakes up. It seems he has been seeing this in his dream. And during the dream, Shadow saw an image of Laura dressed as though she is one of the residents of Cairo during the time of the lynching. When he looks in the mirror, he also sees an image of himself dressed in the clothing of the era, but his face, for a brief second, is gnarled and demonic. Then he picks up a razor and it seems as though he's going to cut his own throat. In the mirror, we can see that he has bullet wounds and that his head is on fire, which seems to be him experiencing what Will James did until he snaps out of it. Then Will James appears behind him and says, "Memento mori," which is a Latin phrase used in medieval Christianity, which means remember you will die. In the next scene, Wednesday takes the small plant or bud that he got from Iktomi, puts it in a flower pot, and pisses on it. And then he begins speaking in Old Norse. The words he's speaking are taken from the poem Voluspa of the Poetic Edda, but he seems to be using them as a kind of incantation to help this bud grow into Yggdrasil, the world tree in Norse mythology. And somehow the pissing factors into that as well. Wednesday leaves to attend to business elsewhere and leaves Shadow at the funeral parlor. Then in New Orleans, we see the St. Louis Cathedral and drop in on Matt Sweeney, who looks like he's been having a horrible time with his bad luck. Sweeney drunkenly argues with this statue of St. Jude, one of the apostles, until he collapses on what looks like a voodoo altar on the streets. Sweeney looks up and sees Laura. At last, Sweeney's luck returns, and she tells him that she would now like to try his method of resurrection. So they both go to see the Baron in the French Quarter. All of these symbols you can see drawn on the walls here are voodoo symbols, and then they arrive at a bar called the Coq Noir, the Black Rooster, which is a symbol in voodoo and also an offering for the Loa. And the Black Rooster is also associated with Mem and Brigitte, who we'll meet soon. Sweeney makes one of his old Celtic coins appear and buys this guy's shirt so that he can look a little classy going into this joint. Inside the bar, we meet the Baron and his wife, Mem and Brigitte, who are both Loa, specifically Death Loa, of the Gede family. Loa are not technically gods, they're beings or spirits in Haitian or Louisiana voodoo who are intermediaries between Bonde, the supreme creator, and the world of humanity. Gede Loa are spirits of the dead and are associated with death and resurrection. The Baron is Baron Samdi. Mem and Brigitte does call him Samdi at one point, but mostly they refer to him as the Baron. And something I realized while researching this, the Baron has numerous incarnations or aspects, of which Samdi is only one. His specialty is resurrection, which is what Sweeney is bringing Laura to him for, and his wife is this woman, Mem and Brigitte, who is another Death Loa, also of the Gede family, Brigitte's origins are said to be in Ireland, and she is associated with the Christian figure Saint Brigitte, as well as the older Celtic goddess of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Brigid, in Irish mythology. In one of my previous breakdowns, one of my commenters pointed out that perhaps that's how Brigitte knows Sweeney, because Sweeney might have some connection to the Tuatha Dé Danann as well, or perhaps he's one of them.
Mad Sweeney? I love you, brother, but not that much. Sweeney fool. Mon frère. How are you?
Brigitte thinks that Sweeney is there to recruit them into Wednesday's war, but he explains that's not why he's there. He's there for Laura and to get his coin back. The Baron tells him to come back after hours to the chef's table. Then we get an interesting scene between Selim and the Djinn. The Djinn questions Selim's faith. The Djinn explains that he was born long before the first Wahy, which is an Arabic word that means revelation. So in other words, it's the word of God that is delivered by the prophet. And he explains that when Islam did appear, he was given a choice: either convert or live his life as a heretic demon, and he chose demon. So Selim's infatuation with the Djinn seems to be getting more and more complicated, because in spite of everything, he does consider himself a devout Muslim. Then Wednesday shows up to retrieve his spear, Gungnir. He makes reference to his old burlesque days.
Keep your audience waiting. Something I learned from my old burlesque days.
Which, based on the preview, I think we'll get to see in a later episode this season. It's also revealed why the Djinn owes Wednesday. He says he was hanging from an amulet on Wednesday's neck, much like a genie in a lamp, but Wednesday released him. It seems like a lot of these characters owe Wednesday for one reason or another. They go to meet the king of the Norse dwarves, who in this show is Ulvis. They also leave the motorbike, and Wednesday says it'll be just fine, but we'll get more into that later. Back in Cairo, we get a sequence following this young man here, who passes by Mr. Nancy. In this shot, you can also see written on the boarded up windows, "Somewhere in America," which I've realized is going to appear in every episode. I missed it in the last episode, but I'm sure if you look for it, you will see "Somewhere in America" somewhere in every remaining episode of American Gods. This young man goes to a house, purchases some narcotics, but then a police officer is there waiting for him. He flees, turns a corner, and sees the flaming head of Will James on a pike, and then he's apprehended by the police officer. In the next scene, this young man is revealed to be Jamar Goodchild, the brother of Ruby Goodchild, who we met in the last episode. So now she's lost both her brother and her grandmother. Ibis reveals that the cause of death is an opioid overdose, but the body has been wounded posthumously, and Shadow makes a connection between the wounds and the man he saw in his dream, Will James. Then Mr. Ibis explains the history of Will James, and actually this photo that he shows here is an actual photo of the crowd during the lynching. Then we go back in time and see the story of Will James. Will was seen crossing paths with a white woman who looks just like Laura, and we can see that Shadow is also in this flashback somehow. Perhaps because Shadow is experiencing Will James' story from his own perspective, and visualizing how it applies to his own life. The woman that Will crossed paths with turned up dead, and you know the rest of the story. As Selim, the Djinn, and Wednesday drive toward Ulvis, the Djinn and Selim continue to argue about his idea of faith, but Wednesday says it's good he has faith, but then tries to present himself as an option for some of his faith, essentially get Selim as a worshipper. Wednesday also says,
"Love who you love. Ask and you shall be emblet,"
which is a reference to Ask and Embla, the first two humans in Norse mythology. Then we have an interesting interaction between Reverend Hutchins and Ruby Goodchild. Ruby wants to leave Cairo, but the Reverend says that she shouldn't be too hasty. He seems to have a hopeful attitude about the future, naively hopeful, and he mentions some civil rights leaders, James Bevel, Al Raby, Dr. King, as a way of presenting his argument, but Ruby isn't buying it. Wednesday, the Djinn and Selim arrive at this factory where Ulvis, the king of the dwarves, dwells. Ulvis immediately says no, thinking that Wednesday wants him to join his war, and mistakes Selim for Manat and Hubal, the same two pre-Islamic deities that Wednesday mistaked him for in the first episode.
"Do I know you? Hubal? Manat?"
Manat, Hubal.
Ulvis refers to the spear Gungnir as the swaying one. The name Gungnir is a variation of a word literally meaning to rock or shake or sway, so it is the swaying one. Ulvis makes reference to his kin, Sindri, who is the dwarf along with his brother Brokr, who forged Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, and Draupnir, Odin's ring. Loki convinced them to do it as part of a forge-off with other dwarves, the sons of Ivaldi. but eventually Sindri and Brokkr won. Alvis explains that the problem with the spear is the runes. When Odin discovered the runes, he received 18 charms. So in order to repower the runes on Gungnir, he needs to go to Dvalin, who is a rune carver, and Dvalin is a dwarf mentioned in the Poetic Edda, said to have introduced the writing of the runes to the dwarves. So runes are his specialty. When they exit the factory, the Djinn's bike is there waiting for them. Odin explains that the bike is actually Freya's battle boar, Hildisvini, or it's an embodiment of Hildisvini, much like Betty is an embodiment of Sleipnir. So it appears that Odin can somehow channel these animals of Old Norse myth into modern vehicles. Back at the Black Rooster, it's finally after hours. Maman Brigitte gives Laura a potion, and this is probably rum mixed with chili peppers, a voodoo potion that is sometimes associated with Maman Brigitte. Afterwards, Laura can taste again, then Brigitte blows smoke into her face, which allows her sense of touch to return. Sweeney says,
I need to turn this one's clock back.
The Baron says they can make a trade, then Brigitte and Sweeney leave the Baron and Laura together. Back at the funeral parlor, Shadow reveals that Will James has cursed his own people, meaning other black people in Cairo, but Shadow doesn't understand why, and Ibis goes into an explanation of the complexity of racism, rage, and self-hate.
You are continually reminded that you have little to no value. It's easy to be convinced that all the rules are stacked against you.
Mr. Nancy shows up, pisses Shadow off so that he leaves. Then Mr. Nancy accuses Ibis of essentially benefiting from the death of Will James and the curse that he created. He also asks him where Anubis is, Mr. Jekyll, which is something I've been wondering. And as Shadow is driving away, he sees a dog, which I believe is Anubis in his animal form. Shadow gets out of his hearse, follows the dog into a sort of frozen moment in time when Will James was lynched, and has a conversation with Will James' flaming head. Shadow tries to understand the rage, the anger that Will James seems to represent. At this point, he seems to be a spirit that represents the oppression and resulting rage of black people in America.
We wear the same skin, but you do not know the nature of the land in which you dwell. Understand my anger.
The issues they bring up in this scene are, quite frankly, a little out of my depth, but that's how I interpret it. I'd love to hear what your interpretation is of the spirit of Will James that Shadow encounters. What do you think it means? In the end, Will James gives his burden to Shadow. At the Black Rooster bar, the Baron makes his potion for Laura, and he says in exchange she has to give him truth, which in this case seems to be them getting it on. And meanwhile, in the other room, Maman Brigitte is doing a dance with these other women, and I believe this dance is the Bonda, which is a dance associated with the Gede Loa. Then Brigitte starts putting the moves on Sweeney, but he resists it at first because of his feelings for Laura. Then, during the funeral of Lily Goodchild, Reverend Hutchins admits that his hopeful attitude about Cairo was a mistake. He lied to the citizens, and he encourages Ruby to leave. After Reverend Hutchins is done with his speech, Shadow takes the pulpit, and as he's walking, we can see flames in his eyes, the spirit of Will James inside him. As he speaks, it also doesn't sound like him. It sounds like Will James is speaking through him. And actually, this speech is probably the best performance I've ever seen Ricky Whittle give on this show.
Memento mori.
Finally, Shadow snaps out of it. The spirit seems to have left him, and once again, he looks confused. In another section of the funeral parlor, Mr. Nancy, Ibis, and Mr. Wednesday, who is returned now, drink beer and tell jokes. Mr. Wednesday says,
Tiger balls to you, Nancy.
which is a reference to a speech that Mr. Nancy gives in the novel about how he stole Tiger's balls. And Mr. Ibis gives his interpretation of why the spirit of Will James still haunts the city.
Maybe Froggy keeps his memory alive to share the pain, the self-hatred, and absence of simple solutions for our people.
But Shadow is not very happy with his explanation. At the end of the scene, we can see that the representation of Yggdrasil has grown quite a bit in one day, so who knows how big it'll get eventually. The morning after, in the Black Rooster, the Baron and Brigitte are gone. Laura and Sweeney wake up alone. Laura says that the potion didn't work, but at the beginning of the scene, we can see that she hasn't used the potion yet, so she still has it, and she's lying to Sweeney. She accuses Sweeney of leading her there as part of Wednesday's grand plan, which Sweeney disputes. Laura storms out, and Sweeney curses at her in Irish Gaelic. He also tries to light his cigarette, which won't light because once again, his luck is gone. And that's the end of the episode. Like I said, for me this was a strong episode. Some of the scenes are very haunting, powerful. What did you think of this episode? Did you like it as much as the previous episodes? Did I miss any references or Easter eggs that you noticed? Or did I get something wrong? Please let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out these other videos about American Gods, and be sure to come back to this channel to join me for American Gods Season 2, Episode 6. Thanks for watching. Until the next episode of American Gods.